New York City did not intimidate Julian Miller, it welcomed him. To Julian, the steel and glass skyscrapers of Manhattan were not symbols of human achievement, but massive, vertical monuments to greed. He moved into a penthouse in Tribeca, a place of white marble and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the millions of ants scurrying below. He loved the height. He loved the way the people looked so small, so insignificant, as if he could reach out his window and crush them between his thumb and forefinger. The year was 2005. The financial world was a roaring engine of excess, and Julian was its most efficient fuel. He had joined Vanguard and Cross, one of the most ruthless hedge funds on Wall Street. He didn't get the job through a resume or a handshake. He got it by uncovering a secret about the hearing partner, a hidden gambling debt, and presenting it as a topic of shared interest. Julian didn't enter the corporate world to work. He entered it to colonize. His office on the 54th floor was a masterpiece of clinical detachment. There were no photographs of Alina or Thomas, no relics of his time at St. Jude. The only art on the walls was a series of large, abstracting blots that looked like spreading shadows. The air was kept at a precise 68 degrees, cold enough to keep a man sharp, cold enough to remind anyone who entered that warmth was not a currency traded in this room. Julian sat behind a desk made of polished obsidian. His morning ritual was a silent ceremony. He would arrive at 5:00 a.m. before the city had even wiped the sleep from its eyes. He would watch the sun rise over the Atlantic, the golden light hitting the buildings but failing to penetrate the tinted glass of his office. He spent his hours reading the digital pulses of the market, looking for the weakest link in the chain of global commerce. He wasn't looking for investments, he was looking for victims. Then there was Robert Sterling, a cruel coincidence of names, perhaps, or a sign that the universe had a dark sense of humor. Robert was the senior managing director, a man in his late 50s with a soft face and a belief in ethical capitalism. He had spent 30 years building the firm's reputation on trust and long-term relationships. To Julian, Robert was a dinosaur, a slow, heavy creature that was taking up space in a world that now belonged to the quick and the heartless. Robert took Julian under his wing, seeing in the young man a brilliance he thought he could temper with wisdom. He invited Julian to his home for dinner, a warm, sprawling estate in Connecticut filled with the smell of wood smoke and the laughter of grandchildren. Julian sat at Robert's table, ate his bread, and drank his vintage wine, all while mentally mapping the house's security system and cataloging Robert's emotional triggers. "You have a gift, Julian," Robert said one evening, his voice full of paternal pride. "But remember, the numbers on the screen are lives. Behind every stock ticker there is a family, a business, a dream. Never forget the human element." Julian nodded, his face a perfect mask of humble contemplation. "I won't, Robert, I promise." But inside, Julian was disgusted. The human element was exactly what made people like Robert weak. It was the flaw in the software. As Julian drove back to the city that night, the Manhattan skyline shimmering like a crown of thorns, he began to draft the plan to remove Robert. It wouldn't be a quick firing. It would be a slow, public dismantling that would leave Robert's ethics looking like a suicide note. The opportunity arrived in the form of Project Phoenix, a massive acquisition of a struggling medical supplies company. Robert wanted to save the company, to restructure it, and protect the thousands of factory workers in the Midwest. Julian saw a different path. He began to create a shadow set of books for the deal. Using a network of shell companies he had established during his final months at university, Julian began to leak information to a rival firm, not enough to ruin the deal, but just enough to make it look like Robert was engaging in insider trading to protect his own pension. He didn't use his own computer. He used a series of public terminals and encrypted accounts. He made the leaks look like they were coming from Robert's personal home network. He was patient. He knew that for a man like Robert, the accusation of dishonesty was more painful than the loss of wealth. Julian wanted to see the look in Robert's eyes when the world he had spent 30 years building turned its back on him. He wanted to be the one to hand Robert the pen to sign his own resignation, all while offering a sympathetic shoulder to cry on. The transition from a predator to a ghost is a subtle art, and Julian Miller was its most devoted practitioner. In the weeks following the dinner at Robert Sterling's estate, Julian lived two lives. By day, he was the brilliant protege, the young man who arrived at Vanguard and Cross before the sun and left long after the janitors had begun their rounds. By night, in the sterile silence of his Tribeca penthouse, he was an assassin of data, a weaver of digital nooses. Julian didn't just want to frame Robert, he wanted to inhabit his life. He began to spend his lunch breaks not in the high-end sushi bars of Wall Street, but in the server rooms and the IT corridors. He learned the rhythm of the firm's internal communications. He discovered that Robert, in his old-fashioned trust, used a password that was a combination of his grandchildren's birthdays. It was a sentimental weakness, a soft spot in an armor of steel, and Julian exploited it with surgical precision. He began to send encrypted emails from Robert's terminal at 3:00 a.m. using remote access tools he had refined since his days at St. Jude. These emails were masterpieces of ambiguity. They didn't say, "I am cheating." They hinted at private arrangements and off-book settlements regarding Project Phoenix. Julian was creating a paper trail that looked like a man trying to save his legacy through illicit means. He was painting a portrait of a fallen hero, and he was using Robert's own brushstrokes to do it. Outside the office, New York was breathing, a heavy, metallic breath that smelled of exhaust and ambition. Julian would often stand at the floor-to-ceiling windows of the firm's boardroom, watching the snow descend upon the Hudson River. To him, the city was a vast, biological machine, and every person on the street was a cell that could be infected. He watched the traders on the floor below, men who screamed and sweated for a fraction of a percent. He despised their heat. He despised their noise. He preferred the cold, silent world of the upper floors where decisions were made that could wipe out entire pension funds with a single keystroke. It was here, amidst the scent of expensive leather and the hum of high-powered air conditioning, that Julian felt most alive. Or rather, it was where his lack of life felt most like power. But even the most perfect ghost leaves a footprint. On a Tuesday in mid-November, as the wind whipped through the canyons of the financial district, Julian saw a face he hadn't seen in years. He was exiting the building, heading toward his car, when he spotted a woman standing near the bronze bull statue. She was wearing a thick olive-green trench coat, her hair tucked under a scarf, but Julian would know that silhouette anywhere. It was Clara. She wasn't the broken girl he had left behind in Oakwood Drive. Her eyes, once filled with fear, were now sharp, narrowed with a professional intensity. She was holding a digital camera and a notebook, talking to a disgruntled former employee of Vanguard and Cross. She was a journalist now, a muckraker for an independent investigative outlet that specialized in white-collar crime. Julian didn't flinch, he didn't hide. He stood on the marble steps of the building and watched her. He felt a flicker of something, not love, not regret, but a cold, electric curiosity. She was the only person in the world who knew the truth about the Golden Child. She was the only one who had seen the ink-stained ruins of her own dreams and knew who held the bottle. Clara turned, her gaze sweeping across the crowd until it locked onto his. For a heartbeat, the city of 8 million people vanished. There was only the brother and the sister, the predator and the witness. Clara didn't smile. She didn't wave. She slowly raised her camera and took a single photo of him, a cold digital capture of the monster in the suit. Then she turned and disappeared into the subway entrance, leaving Julian standing in the cold air, realizing that the past was no longer a ghost. It was a hunter. Later that week, the firm hosted a gala for sustainable investments. Robert was the keynote speaker. He stood on the stage, his voice warm and resonant, talking about the soul of the market. Julian sat at the front table, Sophia, who had become a hollowed-out socialite under his quiet direction, at his side. He wasn't listening to the speech. He was watching the back of the room, and there she was, Clara. She had secured a press pass. She was standing near the pillars, her eyes never leaving Julian. When the speech ended and the room erupted in polite applause, Julian excused himself and walked directly toward her. He moved through the crowd like a shark through a reef. "You've traded the architecture of buildings for the architecture of lies, I see," Clara said before he could speak. Her voice was steady, lacking the tremor of her youth. Julian smiled, a thin, razor-like expression. "And you've traded your dolls for a camera. Do you still think taking pictures can stop a storm, Clara?" "I'm not here to stop the storm, Julian," she whispered, leaning in so the people around them couldn't hear. "I'm here to measure the damage. I know what you're doing to Robert Sterling. I've seen your ghost in the server logs. I've been talking to your old roommate, Oliver. He's not doing well, by the way. He talks in his sleep about a boy who steals shadows." Julian's heart didn't skip a beat, but his mind began to calculate at a frantic pace. Oliver was a leak. Clara was the conduit. The world of New York was suddenly feeling as small as the house on Oakwood Drive. "Oliver was always a weak link," Julian said, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly low register. "And you, Clara, you're still trying to play the hero in a story that was written in ink a long time ago. Be careful. In this city, people don't just lose their dreams, they disappear into the fog." He turned and walked back to the gala, leaving his sister in the shadows. The game had changed. It was no longer about a promotion or a hedge fund. It was a race to see who could destroy the other first. Julian needed to accelerate Robert's downfall. He needed the Project Phoenix bomb to explode tomorrow. The night following the gala was not a night for sleep. While the rest of Manhattan lay under a blanket of freezing rain, Julian Miller sat in the dark of his Tribeca penthouse, the blue light of 3 monitors reflecting in his eyes like a digital fever. The confrontation with Clara had changed the stakes. She wasn't just a nuisance, she was a timer ticking down toward his exposure. He didn't need to be careful anymore, he needed to be fast. He needed to burn the bridge while Robert Sterling was still standing on it. Julian's fingers moved over the keyboard with the grace of a concert pianist. He was no longer just planting seeds, he was harvesting a catastrophe. He accessed the secure servers of Vanguard and Cross through a series of backdoors he had spent months installing. With a single keystroke, he released a flood of pre-scheduled forged documents into the SEC's Securities and Exchange Commission public portal. To any investigator, it would appear as though Robert Sterling had just panicked and tried to hide evidence of a massive embezzlement scheme linked to Project Phoenix. He made sure the digital signature matched Robert's personal encryption key, the one based on his grandchildren's birthdays. Julian took a long sip of ice-cold water, watching the upload progress bar, 80%, 90% complete. The trap was shut. By sunrise, the world would see Robert Sterling not as a man of ethics, but as a desperate criminal. Julian leaned back, watching the rain strike his window. He felt a profound sense of peace. Destruction, he realized, was the only thing that made him feel truly in control of time itself. The next morning, Manhattan woke up to a financial earthquake. At 9:00 a.m., the lobby of Vanguard and Cross was swarmed, not by clients, but by federal agents. The sound of their heavy boots on the polished marble floor was a staccato of doom. Julian stood at his desk, perfectly calm, holding a leather-bound folder. He watched through his glass walls as Robert Sterling was led out of his office in handcuffs. The sight was visceral. Robert's face was the color of wet ash. His hands, usually so steady when he spoke of the soul of the market, were trembling so violently that the metal of the handcuffs rattled, a tiny, pathetic sound that echoed in the silent office. Julian walked toward him as the agents led him to the elevator. He didn't look away. He didn't offer a fake apology. He looked Robert directly in the eyes. "I tried to warn you, Robert," Julian whispered, his voice a masterpiece of calculated tragedy. "I told you the market has no soul. You should have listened." Robert didn't speak. He just looked at Julian with a dawning, horrific realization. He saw, for the first time, that he hadn't invited a protege into his life. He had invited a void. As the elevator doors closed, cutting off Robert's last glimpse of his empire, Julian felt the cold rush of victory. The seat at the top was finally empty. But the victory was short-lived. Julian returned to his desk to find a physical envelope waiting for him. No stamps, no return address, just his name written in his sister's sharp architectural script. Inside was a single photograph. It was a picture of the Blue Mist Motel in New Jersey, the place where Julian had sent his fixer to find Oliver. But in the photo, the door to room 214 was wide open, and standing in the doorway was not Oliver, but Clara, holding a digital recorder. On the back of the photo, she had written, "You were so busy watching the market, Julian, that you forgot to watch the shadows. Oliver is safe. He's with the FBI now. And unlike Robert, he has a story to tell that your money can't erase. See you at the hearing." Julian felt the first genuine crack in his armor. The golden child had underestimated the sister he had tried to break. He realized that while he was playing a game of numbers, Clara was playing a game of blood. And in the city of Manhattan, blood always leaves a trail that even the heaviest rain can't wash away. In the canyons of Manhattan, the silence after a storm is always the loudest. Julian sat in his office, the photograph of the Blue Mist Motel held between his fingers like a shard of glass. For the first time in his life, the cold logic that had been his compass felt like it was spinning out of control. Clara wasn't just a sister anymore, she was a glitch in his perfect system, and glitches, as Julian knew, had to be purged. Julian didn't leave the office that night. He ordered the building's security to lock down the executive floor. He spent hours packing the length of the boardroom, his reflection walking beside him in the dark windows. He began to visualize the FBI's interrogation room where Oliver was likely sitting. He could see Oliver, pale, stuttering, finally exhaling the secrets he had carried since their days at St. Jude. Every time a siren wailed on the street below, Julian's jaw tightened. He wasn't afraid of the law, he was afraid of the loss of status. To him, a prison cell was just a room, but being seen as a failure was a death sentence. He realized that to stop the leak, he had to cut the pipe at both ends. He needed to find where the FBI was holding Oliver, and he needed to disqualify Clara as a credible witness. By 4:00 a.m., Julian had a plan. He accessed the firm's private security budget, a massive pool of dark money used for corporate espionage. He hired a team of digital pathologists, hackers who didn't work for money, but for the thrill of the kill. "I want her life dismantled," Julian told them over an encrypted line, his voice a low, rhythmic rasp. "Find every mistake she's ever made, every debt, every failed relationship, every mental health record. If she doesn't have a history of instability, create one. I want the world to see a woman who is obsessed with her brother's success because she couldn't build a life of her own." He spent the rest of the night creating a deepfake trail. Using the same software he used to mimic Robert's handwriting, he began to craft a series of emails, allegedly from Clara to a foreign intelligence agency, suggesting that she was selling corporate secrets. He wasn't just trying to win, he was trying to erase her existence. He wanted her to walk into that hearing not as a whistleblower, but as a traitor. The narrator describes the city at dawn, a bruised purple sky bleeding into a dirty orange. The steam rose from the subway grates like the breath of an exhausted beast. Julian looked at the photo of Clara again. He noticed something he had missed before, a small, silver locket around her neck. It was the same locket their mother, Eleanor, used to wear. Momentary flash of a memory hit him, Eleanor singing to them in the kitchen of Oakwood Drive. For a split second, Julian felt a sharp, stabbing pain in his chest. Was it regret? Was it a remnant of a heart he thought he had successfully surgically removed? He looked at the locket in the photo, and then with a slow, deliberate motion, he used his cigarette lighter to burn the part of the photo where the locket was. He watched the silver image turn to black ash. The memory was gone. The predator was back. As the first rays of sun hit the spire of the Empire State Building, Julian received a ping on his private server. His team had found a lead. Oliver wasn't in a government facility. Clara had moved him to a private clinic in upstate New York using a false name. Julian grabbed his coat. He didn't call the police. He didn't call his lawyers. He called the fixer he had used before, the one who was still loyal because Julian held his family's mortgage. "We're going to the Catskills," Julian said, stepping into the elevator, "and this time there will be no speakers, no pillows, only the end of the story." Drive to the Catskill Mountains was a journey from the cacophony of ambition to the silence of judgment. As Julian's black sedan wound through the skeletal trees and the thickening fog of upstate New York, he felt a strange sense of clarity. He believed he was the hunter, moving toward an isolated clinic to silence a witness. He didn't know that Clara had stopped playing by the rules of journalism and had started playing by the rules of the very architecture he had taught her, the architecture of the trap. The clinic was a converted mansion, a place of white stone and iron gates nestled deep in the forest. Julian stepped out of the car, the cold mountain air biting at his lungs. He didn't bring a weapon, he brought a briefcase filled with non-disclosure agreements and power of attorney forms. His plan was to legally kidnap Oliver, to declare him mentally unfit and take guardianship, effectively erasing his ability to testify. He entered the lobby, his leather shoes clicking on the hardwood floors. The air smelled of lavender and antiseptic, the smell of a controlled environment. He found Clara sitting in the sunroom looking out at the frozen lake. She was alone, no Oliver, no FBI, no bodyguards. Julian sat across from her, placing his briefcase on the table with a surgical click. "You look tired of running, Clara," he said, his voice a smooth, dangerous silk. "I have the papers here. Oliver is going to be committed to a high-security facility under my name. His testimony will be ruled as the ramblings of a paranoid schizophrenic. And you will be sued for every penny you've earned for violating corporate privacy laws." Clara didn't flinch. She didn't even look at the briefcase. She looked at Julian with a terrifying, serene smile. "You always were a perfectionist, Julian. You covered every digital trail. You erased every email. You even forged Robert's signature perfectly." "I did," Julian replied, leaning back, "and there is no evidence to prove otherwise." "Actually," Clara whispered, leaning in, "that's where you're wrong. You forgot the one thing that isn't digital. You forgot the Oakwood ledger." Julian's heart, for the first time in years, felt a jagged pulse of panic. The Oakwood ledger was a small, leather-bound notebook their father, Thomas, had kept in the basement. It wasn't about business. It was about Julian's childhood experiments. Thomas had recorded every fire Julian set, every lie he told, and most importantly, he had saved the original ink samples of the pens Julian used to practice his forgeries as a boy. "I found it, Julian," Clara said, her voice growing stronger. "I didn't take it to the press. I took it to a forensic ink analyst. We've compared the chemical signature of the ink you used to frame Robert Sterling with the ink samples in Dad's ledger. It's a 100% match to a rare, vintage fountain pen you stole from his collection years ago, a pen you still use today." The narrator describes the legal paradox. Julian had spent his life becoming a digital ghost, but he had been caught by the physical ghosts of his own past. The ledger wasn't just proof of one crime, it was the Rosetta Stone that unlocked every lie he had ever told. As Julian reached for his briefcase, the doors of the sunroom opened. A woman stepped in, wearing a sharp suit and carrying a silver recorder. She wasn't an FBI agent, she was the district attorney of Manhattan. "Mr. Miller," she said, her voice echoing in the high-ceilinged room, We've been listening to this entire conversation via the clinic's security system, which, by the way, your sister helped us install. We have the ledger, we have the ink analysis, and more importantly, we have your confession that you intended to commit a witness to silence him." Julian looked at Clara. For the first time, he saw her not as a sister or a victim, but as a superior predator. She hadn't tried to kill him. She had let him walk himself into a cage built of his own history. "It's a beautiful place, isn't it?" Clara said, standing up and walking toward the door. "The silence, the trees. You'll have a lot of time to think about it, Julian, in a room that won't have a view of Manhattan." The fall from the 90th floor of a Manhattan skyscraper to the concrete floor of a federal holding cell is not measured in feet, but in the slow, agonizing death of the ego. Julian Miller had spent his entire life building a cathedral of glass around his soul, a place where he was the only God and the only law. But on the morning of his induction into the Northern State Penitentiary, the glass didn't just crack, it shattered into a million jagged shards, and for the first time, Julian had to walk over them barefoot. The narrator describes the processing room, a place where humans are turned into inventory. The air was thick with the smell of industrial-grade disinfectant and the sour, metallic tang of fear. Julian stood in a line of men, his expensive silk shirt stained with the sweat of a sleepless night in transit. When it was his turn, the guards didn't look at his face. They looked at his chest, where a number would soon be burned into his identity. "Strip," the guard barked, a single word that carried more power than any board of directors meeting Julian had ever chaired. Julian hesitated. His clothes were his armor. To be naked was to be defenseless. As he unbuttoned his shirt, the one that cost more than the guard made in a month, he felt a cold, oily shiver crawl down his spine. He folded the shirt habitually, a remnant of his golden child perfectionism, but the guard grabbed it and threw it into a gray plastic bin marked decontamination. Then came the hair. The narrator describes the sound of the electric clippers, a low, angry snarl that sounded like a saw cutting through bone. Julian watched in the scratched stainless steel mirror as his golden hair, his pride, fell in clumps to the floor. It looked like dead leaves. As the cold metal of the clippers touched his scalp, Julian felt a strange, hollow sensation in his chest. It wasn't just hair falling, it was the golden child dying. He looked at the stranger in the mirror, a man with hollow eyes and a naked, vulnerable skull, and for the first time in his life, Julian Miller didn't know who he was looking at. They handed him his new skin, a jumpsuit of garish, synthetic orange. The fabric was stiff and smelled of cheap detergent and the ghost sweat of the men who had worn it before him. When Julian pulled it on, the material scratched his skin, a constant, abrasive reminder that he no longer belonged to the world of velvet and silk. He was led through a series of heavy, hydraulic doors. Thrum clang, each door sounded like a guillotine dropping on his past. The hallway was a tunnel of gray concrete, lit by flickering fluorescent lights that gave everything a sickly, jaundiced hue. He was no longer Julian Miller, the architect of finance. He was inmate 88,421, a digit, a piece of data in a system he couldn't hack. His cell was 6 paces long and 4 paces wide, a stone box designed to crush the spirit. The bed was a slab of steel bolted to the wall, covered by a mattress so thin it felt like a mockery of comfort. Julian sat on the edge of the bunk, his hands resting on his knees. The silence of the cell wasn't peaceful, it was heavy. It was a silence that demanded to be filled. And that was when the voices started, not real voices, but the echoes of the people he had dismantled. In the absolute quiet of the Iron Kingdom, Julian heard the sound of Robert Sterling's voice from the dinner in Connecticut. "Remember, Julian, the numbers are lives." He heard the sound of Sophia's weeping from the mental ward. He heard the sound of his father's pen scratching in the ledger. He tried to shut them out. He tried to calculate stock prices in his head, to build complex financial models to distract himself. But the numbers wouldn't come. The logic that had been his superpower was failing him. In its place, a new, terrifying emotion was beginning to take root: shame. It started as a small heat in his gut, spreading upward until his throat felt tight. He looked at his hands, the hands that had typed the emails that destroyed lives, and they began to shake. Not a violent tremor, but a subtle, rhythmic vibration. He couldn't stop it. The predator was shivering in the dark, and for the first time he realized that the person he had hurt the most wasn't Robert or Sophia or even Clara. It was the little boy who used to sit in the basement, just wanting to be seen. Time in the Iron Kingdom is not a river that flows, it is a swamp that stagnates. For Julian Miller, the clock had stopped being a tool for profit and had become an instrument of torture. Every second was a heavy, leaden drop of water falling onto his skull, echoing in the hollow chambers of a mind that was slowly turning against itself. He was no longer living in Manhattan. He was living in the spaces between the bricks of his own guilt. Julian began to study his cell with the obsessive precision he once reserved for financial spreadsheets. He knew every crack in the gray concrete walls. One particular fissure near the ceiling looked like a distorted map of his childhood home in Oakwood Drive. He watched the way the pale, sickly light of the hallway filtered through the steel bars of his door, creating a ladder of shadows on the floor. He noticed the dust. In Manhattan, dust was something that servants removed. Here, dust was his only companion. He watched the motes dancing in the singular shaft of light, realizing that he was just like them, tiny, insignificant, and moved by forces he could no longer control. He would spend hours sitting on the edge of his bunk, staring at a single rust stain on the iron frame, imagining it was a blood stain from a man who had occupied this space before him. Was he still alive? Did he also lose his soul between these four walls? The questions were like termites, eating away at the wooden pillars of his arrogance. The narrator describes the walk of shame, the daily march to the mess hall. Julian moved in a line of broken men, the sound of their rubber-soled shoes on the linoleum floors creating a rhythmic, soul-crushing beat. The mess hall was a cavern of noise and violence. The smell was an assault, boiled cabbage, industrial grease, and the sour scent of 500 unwashed bodies. Julian stood in line, holding a plastic tray that was scratched and stained from years of use. When the server plopped a scoop of gray, unidentifiable mash onto his tray, Julian didn't look up. He didn't complain. He sat at the end of a long, bolted-down table. Across from him sat a man with eyes like burnt coals, a veteran of the system. The man didn't speak. He just stared at Julian's soft, uncalloused hands, hands that had never known a day of physical labor. "You have the look of a man who killed people with a pen," the prisoner rasped, his voice sounding like sandpaper on stone. Julian didn't answer. He looked down at his food, but he didn't see the mash. He saw the face of Sophia the last time he had visited her in the ward. He remembered how her hands had trembled just like the man across from him. He realized that the pen the prisoner spoke of was more lethal than any knife. He felt a sudden, violent surge of nausea, not from the food, but from the realization of his own lethality. He pushed the tray away, his appetite replaced by a cold, hollow ache in the center of his chest. In the quiet hours of the afternoon, when the prison fell into a tense, vibrating lull, Julian was allowed a single sheet of paper and a golf pencil. He stared at the blank surface for what felt like centuries. He wanted to write to Clara. He wanted to tell her what. He placed the pencil to the paper, but his hand froze. The word sorry felt too small, too cheap. It was a word for a child who had broken a vase, not for a man who had shattered lives. He began to write, describing the way the light hit the floor of his cell. He wrote about the smell of the disinfectant. He wrote about the dreams he had of their father. But then he saw his own handwriting, the sharp, slanted script he had used to forge Robert's signature. He saw the R and the S, and he felt a physical jolt of electricity run through his arm. He crumpled the paper into a tight ball, his breathing becoming shallow and ragged. He realized he couldn't even write a letter without seeing the ghost of his crimes in the very shape of his letters. He put his head in his hands, and for the first time since he was a small boy hiding in the basement, Julian Miller felt a hot, stinging tear slide down his cheek. It wasn't a tear of self-pity. It was a tear of pure, unadulterated shame. As the moon rose over the prison walls, casting a cold, silver glow over the yard, Julian stayed awake. He listened to the breathing of the prison, the coughs, the snores, the distant shouts of a man having a nightmare. He felt a strange, new connection to these men. He used to think he was superior to them because he wore a suit and they wore rags. Now he saw that they were all the same. They were all broken parts of a machine that didn't know how to love. He leaned his head against the cold concrete of the wall and closed his eyes. He didn't pray, he didn't know how, but he made a silent vow to the shadows. If he ever left this iron kingdom, he wouldn't leave as a predator. He would leave as a man who finally understood the weight of a single human life. The golden child was gone, buried under layers of orange fabric and gray stone. In his place, something fragile and human was beginning to breathe. In the world of finance, Julian Miller had been a master of the long game. He could wait months for a stock to plummet or a rival to weaken. But in the Iron Kingdom, the game was no longer about profit. It was about survival against the most relentless enemy of all, his own memory. The walls of his cell were no longer just concrete. They had become a cinematic screen, playing back the wreckage of his life in a continuous, haunting loop. It was a Thursday, a day indistinguishable from the gray blur of the others, when Julian was summoned to the visiting room. He walked the long, sterile corridor, the sound of his plastic sandals on the linoleum sounding like a clock ticking toward an execution. Behind the scratched plexiglass sat Clara. She wasn't wearing her investigative journalist mask today. She looked pale, her eyes rimmed with red, holding a manila envelope as if it contained a bomb. Julian sat down, the cold metal of the chair biting into his thighs. He picked up the heavy plastic phone, his hand trembling so slightly that only someone who knew him as well as Clara could see it. "You look different, Julian," she whispered. Her voice was thin, stripped of the anger that had fueled her for years. Julian didn't try to charm her. He didn't offer a clever remark. He looked at the reflection of his own shaved head in the glass and felt a wave of profound nausea. "The orange suit doesn't hide much, Clara. What are you doing here?" Clara pressed a newspaper clipping against the glass. The headline was a jagged blade, "Former CEO Robert Sterling in critical condition after stroke." It was as if the oxygen had been sucked out of the room. He felt a sudden, sharp pressure behind his eyes. Robert, the man who had shared his bread with him. The man whose only crime was believing that Julian Miller had a soul. "The doctors say the stress of the trial, the shame, it was too much for his heart," Clara said, her voice cracking. "He's in a coma, Julian. He'll likely never wake up. He'll die thinking he was a criminal because of the lies you wrote in his name." Julian didn't speak. He couldn't. He felt a cold, leaden weight settle in his stomach. He remembered the smell of the wood smoke in Robert's house in Connecticut. He remembered the way Robert had looked at him with paternal pride. He realized then that he hadn't just framed a man, he had murdered a spirit. The numbers he had manipulated were indeed lives, and he had extinguished one of the brightest. Julian dropped the phone. The heavy plastic clattered against the metal shelf with a sound like a bone breaking. He leaned his forehead against the cold plexiglass, his breath fogging the surface, obscuring Clara's face. A sound escaped him, a low, guttural moan that didn't sound like a human voice. It was the sound of a structure collapsing. He began to sob, not the quiet, controlled weeping of a manipulative actor, but the violent, chest-heaving gasps of a man who had finally realized he was a monster. The guards moved toward him, their hands on their batons, but Clara shouted at them to wait. She watched her brother, the golden child, the predator of Manhattan, crumple into a pile of orange fabric on the dirty floor. He was clutching his own chest, as if trying to hold his heart together before it shattered completely. "I killed him," Julian gasped, his voice choked with salt and shame. "Clara, I killed him. I killed everyone." For the first time in his life, Julian Miller didn't care who was watching. He didn't care about his image. He lay on the floor of the visiting room, the cold tiles against his cheek, and let the waves of regret drown him. He was no longer the architect of finance. He was a man standing in the ruins of a city he had burned down for no reason at all. Back in his cell, Julian didn't sleep. He spent the night on his knees, his forehead pressed against the iron leg of his bunk. The narrator describes the true darkness, not the absence of light, but the presence of one's own sins. He didn't think about his appeal. He didn't think about his lawyers. He thought about the ink. He thought about the ledger. He reached for a scrap of paper, the one he had tried to write on before, and this time he didn't care about his handwriting. He didn't care about being perfect. He wrote 3 words over and over again until the lead of the pencil was flat and his fingers were cramped. "I am sorry, I am sorry, I am sorry." He wasn't writing it to a judge. He was writing it to the universe. As the first light of dawn touched the bars of his cell, Julian Miller realized that the Iron Kingdom wasn't his prison, his mind was. And the only way out was to find a way to fix what he had broken, even if it took 100 lifetimes. In the cold, echoing chambers of the Northern State Penitentiary, Julian Miller discovered a truth that no Ivy League university had ever taught him, that the soul, once broken, can only be mended by the very things it once despised, humility and sacrifice. The news of Robert Sterling's stroke had been the final hammer blow. Julian no longer wanted to rule the Iron Kingdom. He wanted to clean the blood off its floors. Julian began to spend his library hours not reading law books to find a loophole for his release, but studying the complex web of his own financial crimes. He sat at a battered wooden table, the air smelling of old paper and stale coffee, and began to map out the restoration. He used the prison's monitored computer system under the guise of legal research to access the remnants of his hidden offshore accounts. For years, he had hoarded this wealth as a scorecard of his superiority. Now, it felt like a pile of toxic waste. With the precision of a surgeon, he began to move the funds. He didn't send them to himself. He created a series of anonymous educational trusts and medical relief funds. He moved $4 million into an account for Oliver, disguised as a forgotten inheritance from a distant relative. He funneled a vast sum into a foundation for mental health research, specifically dedicated to cases like Sophia's. He was a ghost in the machine once again, but this time he wasn't weaving nooses. He was weaving safety nets. For the old Julian, the greatest thrill was the world knowing he was the smartest person in the room. Now, he had to endure the ultimate torture, doing something good and never receiving credit for it. Every time he hit the enter key to transfer a life-changing sum to a victim, a part of his old self screamed in protest. They will never know it was you, the voice whispered in his head. They will still hate you. You are losing your power. The collapse on the visiting room floor was not merely a nervous breakdown. It was the formal execution of the entity known as Julian Miller. As the guards dragged him away from the glass, his body went limp, as if the very bones of his arrogance had been dissolved. He returned to his cell, but he did not return alone. He brought with him the ghost of Robert Sterling and the haunting image of a heart that had stopped beating because of a web of lies Julian had spun with a smile. For the next 3 weeks, Julian inhabited a profound, tomb-like silence. He refused the yard, refused the law library, and turned away the high-priced attorneys sent by the firm to patch the scandal. He spent hours watching a single, microscopic dust mote dancing in the thin sliver of sunlight that pierced his high, barred window. He started to smell the rot in his own memories. Every successful deal, every brilliant manipulation now reeked of decay. He realized that his intelligence, which he had once worn like a crown, was nothing more than a scalpel he had used to vivify the hearts of those who loved him. In those frozen nights, Julian would press his palm against his chest, checking to see if his own heart was still beating, or if it had died in that Connecticut house alongside Robert's innocence. Once his hands stopped shaking enough to hold a pencil, Julian began a new project. He wasn't plotting an escape, he was plotting a restoration. He requested access to the legal annex, but instead of searching for loopholes, he began to write to the district attorney. Julian wrote a microscopic, exhaustive confession. He didn't just cover the Sterling case, he went back to the age of 14. He detailed the destruction of Sophia, the dismantling of Oliver's future, and the theft of his father's legacy. He wrote as if he were trying to bleed his sins onto the paper. Every page he finished made him feel a strange, terrifying lightness, as if the iron shackles on his wrists were slowly turning into feathers. He was no longer trying to win, he was trying to be seen for exactly what he was, a monster seeking a cage. On a day so cold the breath froze in the air, Julian was forced into the yard. There he was confronted by Parker, a massive inmate who had previously tried to extort him. Parker moved in, looking for the golden child's weakness, but he found something far more unsettling. "You can take my food, Parker. You can break my ribs until they puncture my lungs," Julian said, his voice flat, devoid of the old predatory edge. "But you cannot inflict more pain on me than I have already inflicted on myself." The confusion on Parker's face was total. The other inmates saw something terrifying in Julian's eyes, the look of a man who had already attended his own funeral. They saw a man who no longer feared death because he was living it every second. From that day on, a strange, respectful silence surrounded him, not because they feared his power, but because they recognized his grief. At the end of the month, a letter arrived from Clara. It contained no photos, no threats, and no legal documents. It was a single sentence on a torn piece of notebook paper. "Robert opened his eyes yesterday. He whispered your name, but he didn't curse you. He asked why." The letter fell from Julian's hand. Why? That question was the true prison. Julian had no answer, not yet, but he decided he would spend the rest of his life, whether inside these walls or out, searching for one. He began to write back to Clara, not as the golden child, but as a broken brother trying to learn the alphabet of being human. In the depths of the Iron Kingdom, Julian Miller discovered that the loudest sound in the universe is not the slamming of a steel door or the roar of a riot. It is the sound of a man's own heartbeat when he has finally realized that he is the villain of his own story. For years, Julian had used silence as a weapon to intimidate others. Now, silence was the judge, the jury, and the executioner. Every minute spent in his 6-by-9-foot cell was a confrontation with a ghost he could no longer outrun. The narrator describes the physical toll of regret. Julian's skin, once glowing with the health of a man who ate in 5-star restaurants, had turned the color of the concrete walls, a sickly, translucent gray. His eyes, once sharp and predatory, were now hollowed out, as if the light inside him had retreated to a place no one could reach. Every morning at 5:00 a.m., before the first bell rang, Julian would sit at the small, bolted-down desk. He was allowed one golf pencil a week. He used it until it was nothing more than a splinter, a tiny nub of lead held between his calloused fingers. He wasn't writing a memoir or a legal defense. He was writing the ledger of debts. Every morning at 5:00 a.m., before the first bell rang, Julian would sit at the small, bolted-down desk. He was allowed one golf pencil a week. He used it until it was nothing more than a splinter, a tiny nub of lead held between his calloused fingers. He wasn't writing a memoir or a legal defense. He was writing the ledger of debts. He spent hours describing the exact shade of blue in the eyes of the secretary he had fired to cover his tracks. He wrote about the way the light hit the floor in the hallway of the nursing home where he had abandoned the memories of his mother. He was meticulously documenting the unseen damage, the lives he had bent until they snapped. He realized that for every dollar he had stolen, he had taken 1,000 hours of peace from someone else. He began to calculate his sentence not in years, but in the number of apologies he owed to the world. The mess hall remained a theater of violence for most, but for Julian it became a monastery. He sat in the same spot every day, eating the bland, metallic-tasting food without a word of complaint. One afternoon, a young inmate, a boy no older than 20 who had been caught in a botched robbery, sat across from him. The boy was shaking, his eyes darting toward a group of older inmates who were circling him like vultures. In the old world, Julian would have seen this as a transaction, an opportunity to gain a debt or a pawn. But the new Julian felt a sharp, localized pain in his chest. He saw Oliver in this boy. He saw the innocence that he himself had once taken joy in destroying. Julian didn't stand up and fight. Instead, he did something far more powerful. He slid his tray toward the boy and looked at him with a gaze so calm it was unnerving. "Eat," Julian said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp from weeks of disuse. "And when you're finished, walk behind me to the library. I will show you how to read the codes of this place, not to survive it, but to leave it better than you found it." The predators watched from the shadows, confused. They couldn't understand a man who offered protection without asking for a price. They didn't realize that Julian was paying a debt that had nothing to do with them. He was protecting the version of himself he had murdered years ago. That night, a fever took hold of Julian. As he lay on the thin mattress, the walls of the cell seemed to dissolve. He wasn't in prison anymore. He was back at the gala in Manhattan. He saw Robert Sterling standing on the stage, but instead of a tuxedo, Robert was wearing a hospital gown, his face half paralyzed, his eyes filled with a terrifying, silent question: why Julian? In his delirium, Julian finally answered, not with a lie, not with a strategy, but with the raw, bleeding truth. "Because I was empty, Robert," he whispered into the dark of the cell. "I thought if I filled the void with enough power, enough money, and enough of other people's lives, I would finally feel solid. I didn't realize that the only way to be real is to be kind. I stole your life because I didn't know how to live mine." He reached out to touch Robert's hand, but his fingers only met the cold, unyielding iron of the bunk bed. He woke up crying, not the silent tears of a man in pain, but the deep, racking sobs of a man who was finally, painfully, becoming human again. At the end of his 4th year, Julian received a letter from the warden's office. Due to his extraordinary cooperation with the district attorney and his role in dismantling the very offshore networks he had built, his sentence was being commuted to time served, followed by 10 years of strict probation. He was being let out. But Julian didn't feel the rush of joy he expected. He looked at the orange jumpsuit folded neatly on his bed. He looked at the concrete walls that had been his only honest friends for 4 years. He realized that leaving the Iron Kingdom was the easy part. The hard part would be walking back into a world where his name was a curse, and trying to prove that a man who had built a kingdom of ice could learn to live in the sun. He walked to the gate carrying nothing but a small manila envelope containing his unsent letters to Robert. As the heavy doors creaked open, the narrator describes the smell of the outside world. It smelled of rain, exhaust, and infinite, terrifying possibility. Julian Miller took one step forward not as a king, but as a beggar seeking the one thing he couldn't steal: forgiveness.